For RCR TV, I'm Sean Kinney, and welcome to HetNet Happenings, where we take a look at all things DAS, small cell, Wi-Fi, and much, much more.
CommScope, thinking beyond today's technology to help you make the best decision for your network and your business. Telecom Careers, the #1 global telecom and wireless job board, telecomcareers.com.
Welcome back to HetNet Happenings. Our show this week's brought to you by our friends at CommScope. Today we're going to hear from Richard Grimes. Richard is the Chief Operating Officer for the DAS and Small Cell Group at InSite Wireless. InSite's been in the news as of late. That's a privately held company that on May 13th, I believe, was purchased by Capital Tower. Richard was the CEO and co-founder of Capital Tower, and through the acquisition, he transitioned into that new COO role. He sat down with our editorial director and CEO here at RCR Wireless, Jeff Mucci. Two of them talked about a lot of things, including DAS, small cell, and co-location. Co-location is one of those topics that kind of flies under the radar, but it has a real fundamental importance to the telecom industry. We're going to hear more about that later. One of the first questions we posed to Richard is based on a lot of trending discussion in the telecom industry. This all started a couple weeks ago with a very click-worthy news article, "Is DAS dead?" So we posed that question to Richard, and he certainly did not seem to think so. Let's take a look.
I know our team has written about DAS being dead, and others around social media have been talking about DAS being dead. How do you respond to those comments?
Well, I think the patient is alive and well. If you look at from the venue perspective, as well as the carrier's perspective, as well as from InSite's perspective, and the activity based upon venues that we're focused on, be it at different verticals from hospitality to sports entertainment, transportation, and your hospitality resorts, it's probably as busy and focused both for 2015 and looking out as I've seen since DAS got started when I was initially doing that some 15 years ago.
And I was at PCI Wireless Infrastructure Show a couple weeks ago, and I think one of the big conversations was the applicability of DAS in smaller venues. Because of cost concerns. How is DAS technology changing to be more cost effective for smaller venues?
Well, I think you have to look at the technology solutions almost like a toolbox with different tools and applying different applications of technology that will support both the business model and the needs and the requirements of that venue. So from a smaller venue, it may be solely an enterprise solution, so it's very cost sensitive, and as a result, you may deploy, infrastructure that is efficient from a capital standpoint, from an operating expense standpoint, where you have limited participation from, if you will, our standpoint, or from the carriers. Carriers may be just dedicating a signal source for that. But I look at each venue based upon size, scope, strategic, or first tier, second tier. As you're bringing a toolbox of both the business model and the technology solutions to that venue, and not any one venue is the same. And your from a design criteria, your technology solution, as well as the business model that works for all parties and stakeholders involved, it varies. So in answering your question, is DAS dead? I don't see DAS as dead. I think it, like any technology and deployment, it evolves. Much in the tower side, where you had covered sites, and now you do infill with capacity, and then you have the evolution of moving towards a data focus, in a wireless network. I think you apply that same tool to DAS. It depending upon the infrastructure, the venue type, it can be, costly, but there are technology solutions that are enabling that and going forward. I think, from, you look at from beacon to Bluetooth to Wi-Fi to cellular, it's a holistic approach based upon what tools you have in the toolbox, and trying to be very smart and strategic, and have it be a collective decision by both the venue, the carriers, as well as ourselves that, look to design and manage and invest in these venues on a long-term basis. But I'm very bullish in it, and that's my crystal ball. But my crystal ball usually only goes hour by hour, and I think if you move past that, it just promotes humility.
So from Richard's perspective, DAS is very much alive and well, but he did offer the caveat that his prediction does not have an unlimited horizon. We hear so much about small cells, and although the actual deployments haven't kept pace with the projections, a lot of people think 2015 is really going to be a big year for the carrier commercialization of small cell. The way this impacts DAS is they provide a lot of the same functionality to the end user, so then you kind of dig into the business case, which makes more sense to deploy from a CapEx and OpEx perspective. Jeff and Richard talked a little bit about that and also brought macro cells into the conversation. Let's take a look at that.
It seems like in the last couple of weeks, we've heard a lot more noise about actual small cell deployments, whereas the previous couple of years, we just heard a lot of talk about small cell. Maybe you could share, if you don't mind, share with us your views on the criteria that carriers and enterprises are making between, do I deploy indoor DAS, outdoor DAS, or small cell?
I think it depends upon, what you're trying to accomplish. And as we alluded to, previously on the, what is the technology and the business model solution that will achieve that? We're evolving towards a tighter footprint, closer density of delivery of that wireless communication for data purposes, for measurements that we talked about on from bounce and beacon, and Bluetooth, and how do you capture? What are you trying to accomplish with that wireless technology? What are the users' requirements? What's the venue's requirements? What's the carriers trying to achieve to be able to do that? So I think from a small cell to outdoor DAS, a lot probably has to do with a combination of density of what you're trying to achieve in that particular environment. What availability do you have from a fiber standpoint? From the infrastructure. Sometimes when you go below the base of the street, you get into Medusa's hair. So you wonder, how can you deliver that? You have certain ratios of where do you house the equipment. I think you're getting into a centralized base of head end that will serve, be it it currently being done in a ODAS environment, and small cell will be the same. Where you'll have centralized small cell or DAS facilities that will house all the equipment, and then the fiber outreach will accomplish either on an IDAS, ODAS basis or a small cell basis. I think one of the misconceptions on with ODAS, outdoor distributed antenna systems, that everyone has found, and even on small cell, you're still dealing with the leasability, the zonability, and constructability of that, and what is the business model to support that. If you're attaching a small cell to a building, you're still dealing with the relationship with that venue and that agreement. You're still, to a certain extent, depends upon the jurisdiction, you're still looking at, what conditional use permits, or is it allowed by right? Are you on street furniture of city-owned property? Those dynamics aren't, changing unless there's some allowed by right that exists, kind of where I grew up on summers on a ranch, where it really doesn't matter, from an outdoor standpoint. But I think the dynamics of leasability, zonability, and constructability, and the business model associated with that is still a dynamic that it impacts any type of deployment, be it small cell or putting a 200-foot tower.
Richard mentioned that a lot of what drives the decision making on the operator and carrier side is the associated business case, right? So depending on what you're trying to do, sometimes one of the technologies is going to be significantly cheaper than the other. So when you get there, you start looking at a cost benefit analysis, and a lot of times that skews towards what's less expensive. So one of the big things that we're seeing in terms of keeping CapEx down in the physical layer is co-location. So imagine you have a DAS that's covering a stadium. You're going to have a neutral provider that has their own DAS equipment, which is in some sort of facility in that stadium. And then you're going to have the 4 different carriers needing access to that DAS for some of their equipment. So when you look at it like that, does it make more sense to have each carrier with their own sort of equipment room, or do you want to co-locate all of that so it's right there in the same place occupying the same footprint? Obviously, that's what's going to make more sense from a cost and an efficiency standpoint. And so when you consider projections for consumer and enterprise data demand, and then figure in what we all sort of expect a 5G metro deployment to look like, space is a big concern. So co-location is obviously a big deal. It's a big deal for DAS, and it's a big deal for small cell. Let's listen in on Jeff and Richard's discussion about co-location.
When you move into small cell, it's like Medusa's hair. Can you talk about some of the specific challenges that you're seeing in carriers or neutral providers getting to those actual small cell deployments and scale?
Well, I mean, you start with being able to, to have the fiber or the connectivity to be able to, go from that access point of that small cell to how you're backhauling it, and the ratios of the technology is going to drive, how many nodes, how many small cells can you have in a given footprint to backhaul that back to a centralized location. But the advantages of what small cell is achieving is 2 fronts. I see. One is it's enabling that closer site density and more localized delivery of that capacity from a wireless communication standpoint. And secondly, it's allowing a much more strategic, much more cost-effective, where you're having a more centralized head-end space where the carrier's signal source base station equipment is housed in a ratio that could be 2 blocks away or 3 blocks away, or greater flexibility of where you can locate that, depending upon where your fiber source and runs and ability to deliver that. But that's the dynamic that I think enables small cell, and that's why it's moving that way. It's being driven by speed to market, trying to get away from the entitlement process that's onerous, the cost associated with that. You want to be able to have greater efficiency in the deployment of your network from a capital standpoint, and then also to be able to achieve the expectations of your user from a capacity delivery and depending upon the environment to be able to be responsive and able to from a retail standpoint or from a medical standpoint to be able to connect to that user in that given location point in time for location-based interface between the user and that venue.
You talked about the centralized head-end. What are some of the options that you're seeing carriers or neutral host providers consider with respect to a centralized location for a small cell deployment?
Well, I think it's really changing a dynamic because depending upon the legacy of Lex in different territories, they have facilities that now are that were wireline that are that really from a capacity standpoint can be utilized or allocated for those centralized locations for delivery of that head-end space. So I think it opens up the real estate options, which is key. Also, from a standpoint of being able to deliver, when you have base stations equipment on roofs or you're trying to house them on the street or below ground, which is always problematic. on a one-by-one basis, that makes it very difficult. So I think it increases, one, the real estate options that you have by delivering that base station equipment. Two, it may or may not be able to be a greater efficiency in your lease costs, because you might be able to utilize, because you have greater options, and greater options can create a greater efficiency in your lease costs and your capital expenditure. And then utilization of existing real estate that the carriers may have, or other infrastructure providers.
And when you say LEC facilities, are you specifically referred to the old Bell central offices, the wire centers?
Right. And there's other players in that space. I mean, you have Frontier, who's making a big move, and with their acquisition and over the last several years on Verizon. So now you have these other players that are coming in that have those facilities, that are looking aggressively to strategically partner and leverage not just the wireline side, but their focus on the delivery of that data and digital media. So the facilities they have by acquisition are becoming an option for what those centralized locations are. But it's a smart move. You have to go to it, because if you're delivering the capacity on a distributed basis, you have to, in order to make that work from a capital standpoint, you have to find some scaling of efficiency. So maybe you have one head-in central location for 10 to 15 to 20. I think the intent of small cell and the evolution of technology for wireless is to increase that ratio, so that you have greater efficiency on your capital deployment, and also being able to deliver in a very localized way that capacity, be it small cell or outdoor or whatever the solution, the tool in that toolbox is trying to achieve.
Do you see a bias going forward in major markets like in New York, Dallas, Chicago, LA, of carriers or neutral hosts looking at a LEC central office or a Frontier central office as compared to, say, a carrier hotel or a co-location facility? How would you compare and contrast the benefits of a Bell CO versus an existing data center?
I think it has a lot to do with what is the relationship, with that entity. Is it going to, from a speed to market, is going to achieve that, and what's the cost? Because it may be your cousin, but it may take you longer. And in the wireless world, as Jeff, all too well, it's flat out. It's Ferraris and Cobras in a race. The wire line is not has never really been in that motivation, at least in comparison to wireless. And so I think you have that dynamic going on. So it's going to matter what's the chemistry and the relationship, even if it is a partner company or a cousin. What's the capital cost, and is it going to be a short-term solution? Because a rework will kill you. And so I think that whatever that head-in space, that centralized space would be, you have to look at at least 5 to 10 years out. It can't be a Band-Aid approach, because it's just really not going to serve you later. And we all know from what the costs associated with site modifications and upgrades from the switch to the actual RAD center, it's very costly. So trying to create that efficiency up front, you'll save on your OpEx and future capital expenditure.
Interesting. Well, for another time, I'd like to circle back on that point, and really and I don't want to get into it now, but does that present the opportunity for a third type of colo facility that's really dedicated for these centralized small cell deployments that are sitting on fiber networks that have the environmentals, but by introducing that type of facility, now you're introducing delays in build time. So it'll be interesting to see if people go into Bell COs, they go into the existing colo facilities, carrier hotels, or you see this new business model emerge where you have this neutral host carrier hotel. But again, you can spend 3 to 4 months or 6 months getting one of those built. So
well, I think that's you're spot on that. And I'll just say that, I think that's a shared focus and strategy for myself and my peers that are similarly in that position.
All right, very interesting. And that was abbreviated segments from that interview. If you'd like to see the whole thing, I'd encourage you to check out the RCR Wireless Noob YouTube channel. You can also check out multimedia content on the RCR TV webpage. I'd like to thank my boss, Jeff, for taking the time to speak with Richard. Richard, thank you for making the time to speak with us. And to the folks at home, thank you for joining us for HetNet Happenings. Please tune in next week.
HetNet Happenings is a production of RCR TV. To reach Sean Kinney or to suggest a show topic for HetNet Happenings, you can reach Sean at skinney@rcrwireless.com. On Twitter at Sean Kinney RCR. To find out more about the latest in HetNet and all things wireless, dig into rcrwireless.com.